Welcome back, everybody. Episode 10 already of the iProgress podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dean, and I'm joined by Craig. So today we are going to be talking about the use of SA mills, what SA mills are, why people use them, why you definitely shouldn't use them, and also some mechanisms which would hopefully help you to avoid the temptation of using them. So before we jump in, as always, make sure to leave a like on the video if you're enjoying the content, share it with your peers and collaborators, and let us know in the comments what you think of SA mills. Have you ever been tempted to use them in the past? So Craig, do you want to start us off with a little bit of a summary about what SA mills are and some of the circumstances where people might have come across them?
Yeah, so there's lots going around on social media that I've seen, particularly maybe in the last couple of weeks. So we're recording this at the beginning of November. I think we're getting to a point now where a lot of students are thinking about where their assessments are going to start falling. What that comes with is a kind of a tendency for lots of people who are online who want to make a little bit of money from students, thinking about how can they target this particular population with a service. So an SA mill really is a company or a person that you can pay to essentially write your essay for you. So you provide them with your research question or your essay title. You give them information about what grade you want, which invariably is a first or an A or whatever you want to get. And then they suggest that they can write that essay to the standard that you want. So that's why these are particularly popular, because it takes the energy, takes the effort away from the student and puts it onto kind of this corporate entity that is then paid to provide a service. And there's obviously lots of reasons that people might use these. Poor time management is one of them, I think, that I've seen quite a lot. So people that I've spoken to in the past who have been tempted to use these kinds of companies typically have just got to maybe a week before the essay's due, realized they've not started it and thought, oh no, I need to do something about this. And then they've kind of shipped out that work to somebody else. There's obviously reasons that this might happen. Thinking through things like if people have got personal circumstances going on at home, maybe where they've not been able to complete the work for some reason. It might be that they've had a death in the family or they've had an illness themselves. Obviously, these are really kind of bad situations for people to be in, but it's about how do you manage that situation in a way that leaves you with some kind of personal and professional integrity as well.
Of course.
As well as you being able to actually complete the work.
Yeah, because as we know from being in academia so long, the entire purpose of the assignments, whatever the assignments are, and we've spoken on previous podcasts about the types of assignments that we give to students and why we do them. The main purpose is for that student to be able to show their knowledge and attainment in a particular area. And yes, I think I always prompt students to say life will happen throughout your degree. There are lots of mechanisms hopefully in place at your given institution to mitigate that, whether that's extenuous circumstances, whether that's a mechanism whereby you can get extensions for a week or a month or whatever is most suitable. But I can definitely see that the temptation would be there, especially if you feel that you're falling behind. So just as a quick kind of logistical thing for our listeners, when people are wanting to use these services, presumably they give them the rubric, so how it's going to be marked, the assignment details, the length of the assignment. And I know you mentioned being able to get an A or a first. Do you know if you can also tailor, so I'm thinking of a student perhaps who wants to fly under the radar with these SA mills. Can you also say, I want a 2-1 here, or I want a 2-2? Is that something that we know or that we can find out?
I mean, I presume so, yeah. So you can basically tailor your, essentially it's a consultancy request, isn't it?
Sure.
You're kind of farming out work to somebody else. So you've got the essay title, the kind of outcome that you want in terms of a grade. You give them the specification, the grading matrix, if there is one, and their job then is to produce a product that is in line with what you've kind of contracted them to do. So yeah, I guess you could ask for a slightly lower grade to try and fly under the radar, as you say. Although I think we'll probably come on to in a few seconds' time why that might not actually be necessary.
Yes, yeah, because obviously you shouldn't be using these services. Craig hit on the kind of key point, which is the third one down for us, but we're going to put it at the top. Is that ethical decision making? A lot of the majority of all degrees have that ethical underpinnings by which students should be acting. It's contracted in terms of the student agreement, the student charter that you hold with the university. So you're breaking those terms of service there. But especially for some of your more professional degrees, that element of acting in an ethical manner is so, so important. It's vital. And if you were to get caught, not only does that hinder the impact of your assignment, it could hinder the impact of your overall degree. And even if you were able to stay in that program, that undergraduate program, that master's program, that PhD program, perhaps, it's almost regardless, because when you leave that institution, your supervisors, they have to be honest about the references that they give. Now, they can't give a really damning and bad reference, but they do have to be honest. And so actually, if you're looking to go into a professional program, maybe a psychological career, having this act of being unethical on your documents is actually going to really hold you back, and I would argue make that career path not an option for you anymore.
Yeah, that's if you get caught. So if you get caught and people know this is what you've done, it's been found through a kind of academic irregularity panel, or however your university frames that, that you've been, I think the phrase that I've seen used is contract cheating. So you've contracted out your work to somebody else and you've cheated to try and get an advantage based on that. So if you've been found guilty, if you want to kind of use the legal kind of verbiage, I guess, then yeah, your supervisor, your tutors would need to report that on references. If you've not been caught, though, it's still an ethical issue. I would say, particularly in discipline. So, like we've mentioned several times now that we come from psychology, but in medicine, in business, in law, if you're not doing the work, if you're not able to meet the learning outcomes of your course, then you have an ethical responsibility to be reporting that in some way to potential employers. If you're, so say if you've done a law degree, maybe you can't be doing legal work when you don't know what you're doing because you've not met the learning outcomes of your course. So it goes back to this idea of professional integrity as well as ethics and being able to actually do the job that you're applying for. And I think this is what a lot of academics get quite wound up about when it comes to these essay mills, because yeah, I mean, we're always going to have students. I think we need to be kind of realistic about, we're always going to have students that are to some degree engaging in some low level plagiarism because of, maybe not intentionally even,
No, of
but
course
just
not. No.
because of the way that they work. But I think with these essay mills, it goes a step further in terms of people trying to pull the wool over our eyes and trying to get an advantage where it's not warranted.
Yeah, and everything you're saying there just kind of oozes this other point that we have, in that we've seen our fair share of documents between us that perhaps we can't prove, but perhaps we have a very strong inkling that do come from essay mills, especially because it doesn't reflect a student's prior learning or the learning around it, or their work around it, should I say. Overall, I would actually say that if we can identify that these are potential irregularities, the products themselves are actually quite poor. We are in a world now where we're encouraging and we're teaching students in a vastly different way to what perhaps happened previously. We've spoken before about how we put quite an emphasis on open science. We want our students to have that element of critical thinking, critical discussion. We're pushing our students to look at preprint articles that aren't published yet. All of these ethoses perhaps aren't being undertaken by the essay mill individuals. And as such, the quality of these documents are far less than what we would expect from our students. And so I kind of guess, just playing devil's advocate, even if you were asking for a first or a piece of work, actually that is not going to be a first or an A piece of work for our current standards. And so I don't believe that essay mills are actually keeping up with our current expectations of the student. And then if you are looking at the wider impact of the student themselves, the whole purpose of us providing that feedback is that the students can grow and that they can develop. They might be in a very weird and hypothetical situation. They might ask 6 different people to produce 6 essays throughout their year on a particular course. Each one is going to be different. Each one is going to be written in a very nuanced way. And so the feedback that we provide is A, useless because we're feeding back on someone else's work. But B, it is actually taking away one of the core opportunities of university, which is that truthful feedback that should help students be able to grow and develop in their own right.
Yeah, so there's 2 points, I guess, to that point. So I'll go to the feedback one first, I think, because it's probably the most important one. I think back maybe 3 or 4 episodes ago, we talked about how first year students can kind of maximize their time at uni, and we talked a lot about assessment and kind of making the most of those feedback opportunities. For me, that's the key thing that you can do at university. You can pay attention to that feedback, ignore the grade that you get. The grade is somewhat irrelevant until you get to your kind of 3rd year, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about building on the feedback that you get. It's about thinking about, what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? How can I grow over time? If you're not writing the work, then why am I, as a marker, spending time, first of all, reading the work and trying to give you feedback? And that feedback is going to be useless to you because you don't know the process that has been undertaken to produce that work. So thinking about that whole assessment and feedback process, if you're going to be using these essay mills, you may as well not submit anything because, I mean, A, if you get caught, you're going to have to redo the work anyway. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be capped at a low grade. Even if you don't get caught, the feedback that you get is going to be meaningless to you. So, yeah, for me, that's a key issue. The second point, though, which is the first point that you actually made, was about the quality of the work that is produced by these places. It is so poor that it's laughable in places. So obviously they don't have the interaction that students have with lecturing staff or with professors. So they don't know exactly what's been going on in the classroom. It might be that certain tips have been given in the classroom to help people with kind of the nuances of some assessments. I mean, just to kind of make this a little bit more objective, rather than it being us kind of being negative about essay mills, you can go on to, I'm assuming people have heard of places like Trustpilot. These kind of rating agencies, I guess, for different businesses. These essay mills have pages on Trustpilot. And I've seen multiple of them where out of 5 stars, it's been kind of 1.5, 2 stars. And people complaining about the service that they've received and that they haven't got the grade that they asked for. Now, obviously, there's a kind of double-edged sword, I guess, of that. And I kind of feel a little bit mixed about those comments because part of me thinks good. If you've tried to cheat in that way, then good. I'm pleased that you haven't got the grade that you asked for, that you felt that you paid for. But it's evidence as well that actually these essay mills are poor quality. If what you're trying to do is farm out the work for you to get an advantage, this is not the way to do it. No. Thinking about how you can build more effective workflows, working together with different members of your cohort, not in a way where you're submitting the same thing, but where you're sharing advice, sharing insights. It's going to be a much better way of you doing it.
100% agree. And I think just kind of moving on to our third topic about how we avoid temptation, one of the core principles that I have in any of my modules that I lead or that I teach on, if I want to stick my nose in other people's modules, is I always make sure that community element's there. As you go kind of more senior in academia, you learn that we're not delivering knowledge to students. That's almost a byproduct. We're delivering scaffolding and ambition and, you know, that nuance and that ability to push yourselves. I was talking to one of my external mentors earlier on in the week, and he said he's a huge professor at multiple different universities now, and it's probably the best piece of advice I've ever been given, and I'll kind of redistribute it here. He said that the material, especially these days, is it's all recorded. It's given to students beforehand, it's delivered, it's recorded, so students can access it afterwards. And so what you're actually saying within that session is by the by. He says that as long as you can deliver that material in an exciting and energetic way that makes students want to grab hold of maybe one or two specific elements, maybe just 5 minutes in a 2-hour session, and it wants those students to go and read more and explore and you know, develop their own knowledge, that's you doing your job to its best potential. And that's a fantastic piece of advice, especially for any early career academic who I've spoken to 3 separate people over the last month who have just started teaching, and what they do is they map out their entire lectures. They might write a script, they might come and try and deliver that script, and it's just robotic, and that's not going to entice a student. What is going to entice a student is you making a few mistakes, you know, correcting yourself, but showing the fact that you are a leader in that room and that you can deliver that knowledge. And I think that's just an excellent piece of advice to share. So in terms of how we might be avoiding some of this temptation, you very much hit on the point of improved workflows. And I think that students working together in harmony, not only kind of in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, having those small working groups that they can go and reflect and develop those ideas, but also having these individual workflows, such as some of the kind of Notion templates that you've been developing, really helps to put into perspective, well, here's my deadline point. Here's the minor milestones in between now and that deadline point. When do I really need to start? Not only to make sure that I'm doing the best possible job of this assignment, but also that I'm having some downtime at the end before I submit. One of the most telltale signs for me that perhaps a student isn't pushing themselves for their potential is when I see work that's been handed in maybe 5 minutes before the deadline. Because what that suggests is that the student's been working right up until that deadline. You know, and sometimes life happens, you know, we all work with students who have other commitments, and that's perfectly fine. But if you can dedicate yourself maybe 2 or 3 days away from that material before you hand it in, that's going to allow you to redraft it with a clearer mind. You're going to be able to identify some of the mistakes you've made and ultimately do a much better piece of that work.
Yeah, and I think I agree. And when I see those kind of submission times, I think, could you have done more in terms of planning that time better? I mean, if they've got their assessment in before the deadline, then fair enough. I think going back to some of the reasons that people might be tempted to use the essay rules, though, it's about when people get maybe a week or 3 or 4 days before the deadline and they've not started anything yet.
Yeah.
It's about how could you have maybe put a workflow in place from the beginning of the term, the beginning of that module, to make sure that you haven't got to that point. So we often talk about kind of setting out time in your diary, so time blocking, making sure you've got 2-3 hours a day to work on a specific task and not be distracted by that. Make sure you're doing that deep work that Cal Newport talks about, making sure that you're free from distraction, you're closing down social media, you're closing down TikTok and whatever people are on now, making sure that you can just work deeply and intently and intentionally on that one piece of work. If you're doing that, even if you're doing that for an hour a week, you're going to be able to very quickly get a 1,500, 2,000 word, 3,000 word essay done.
Yeah.
Within the space of a module. And it's about just being more deliberate with your time, I think.
Yeah, very much so. And it goes back to kind of one of our most successful YouTube videos, which is writing 500 words a day. And the application of that video is meant for PhD students, but actually any sort of assignment that is very much applied for, especially when you look at some of the shorter word lengths that students might have, especially earlier on in their degrees. And I guess one of the core things just to echo back to is that we really do appreciate that sometimes when life does happen, it causes those anxieties, those stresses. Students might not know where to turn to get that support before it's too late, and that's what might lead students to having this last resort, let's use an essay mill type affair. However, if you are able to reach out to these student support services, which should be signposted on all modules, on all program pages, if not, reach out to your personal tutor or your supervisor for that information. As and when that is present, that should help, or at least make people aware of your circumstances, and that's when you can search for these extensions as well. Ultimately, as academics, we just want to make sure that students are provided the utmost opportunities to do their best. And yes, not extensions, especially in the UK, aren't always perhaps as forthcoming as they could or they should be, but where students do need help, I would hope that that help is being given to them. So before we wrap up, Craig, have you got any kind of final words of your take home about essay mills?
Yeah, don't use them. They're rubbish. You're not going to get anything from them. Make sure you're attending classes, make sure you're engaging with student services, and even as a last resort, it's probably better to just not submit anything, get a capped grade, than it is to have something like this on your record.
Perfect. Yeah, I completely agree. So thank you once again, everyone, for tuning in every week. Hope you're enjoying the content. I hope you're enjoying the social media as well. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and in the comments down below, let us know your final thoughts of essay mills. Did you even know they existed? Is this completely new news to you? And make sure you spread the word about how you shouldn't be using them. See you in the next video.